All right, give me a minute here to turn the laptop back on. All right. So everyone has a plan until they wake up the morning at Source on its 10th birthday, and the plan goes right out the window. I missed the very first Source, and I had tremendous weeping and gnashing of teeth for missing it, but I watched every single video. It felt like something really special, not just because of the Loft Group and the At Stake Mafia, and not just because Dan Geer blew my mind with his keynote, but also I really could sense that this was something different. And for me initially, watching that first one and then participating in everyone since except for last year, I felt it was a speakers conference, right? It was the kind of place where everybody that was flying in was a world-class speaker, and the kind of intangible conversations and ideas generated at the bar were really special. You weren't doing it for compliance, you weren't doing it for a big mega con. You were doing it to like really have iron sharpen iron. But then what it really grew into was initially aspirational. It was the bridge between breaking research and business application. So we would get a really nice mix of local New England business leaders, and it forced the research community to ground their work in something that actually mattered to people's day jobs. And that union, I think, is still a pretty special and rare one in the industry. And one of the things I think, if you turn the crank one more time, I think as we picked keynotes and we did the CFPs over the last several years, we tried to also add a third leg to that, which is if we haven't learned how to talk to the business, we're never going to be able to learn to talk to policymakers and things that affect the incentives and the world we live in. So some of us have really treated this as a way to bridge private sector research, private sector security leadership, and public policy. And I'm going to try to touch on some of those things here. And then one more personal note. Who was here the year of the Boston Marathon bombing? I woke up like my body remembered it, like in a very visceral way, so I'm a little rattled, and I apologize in advance by that. I mean, nobody really knew what was happening at that time, right? We didn't know if it was a single bomber, if it was several bombers, if there were more bombs. You might even recall we had to check our bags at the lobby. You couldn't even get in and out of hotels. And we had several great speakers who couldn't even get here because the flights got canceled. And I'm a bit triggered by that memory, but I'm also a bit, encouraged by that. And I might come back to that concept. That was the year that we had Dan Geer and Richard Thiem in the fireside chat, where it was like the left brain of the industry and the right brain of the industry, and it was a really calming force. But we've come a long way since then. But yeah, Source is a pretty special conference. So I entitled this talk, and I'm Choose Your Own Adventure. And I've debated if I was going to do slides at all, and I debated how aggressive I was going to be, but I warned some of you that I'm going to be pretty aggressive. I know we like to hear things that are entertaining, I know we like to hear things that we can do something about, but some of our problems are way too big, and some of our challenges are way too hard, and if we stick to the easy things, all we're left with is the wicked problems. So I'm going to give a few choices throughout this talk. One of them is, do I do any slides or no slides? All right. Some slides? All right. All right. The big question is, do you want this more focused to your day job or more focused to your personal life? Nobody's speaking up.
Tailoring on the fly, is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I am. All right, Tim, which one?
Personal.
Personal. All right. Darn it, you ruined my first joke. All right.
Ask the question, you don't have the answer.
All right, so I'm going to start with no slides. We're going to cover a couple topics. Are the MITRE guys here yet? Okay, so anybody raise your hand if you want to talk something about your day job. Okay, so for those people, congratulations, you've been eaten by a group. Darn it, the joke didn't work. All right, so Bob Rudis is amazing, and Bob Rudis has been working with me last minute on, this is very crude, but we're going to try to tell a story that almost nobody in this room really knows, including some of the MITRE people. And I want to preface this, I'm going to keep this chunk, I'm going to try for 10 minutes, so we can get to some much harder stuff. CVE, the common vulnerabilities and exposures, is critical infrastructure for our space. We use it everywhere. And this is not a bash session on NIST, on CVE, on DHS at all. But it is too big to fail, and it is failing. So I'm not going to show every single aspect of this, but a few of us are putting our heads together to talk about things that way too few people know. So I'm really curious, after I go through this in the break, find me and tell me how many of these things you already knew. But people who are really, really close to this topic really haven't taken a step back to see how far from shore we've drifted. So Bob Rudis has started working on this data visualization, and we're going to work the kinks out. This is an alpha version, and I'm going to tell you a little story. Can you guys read some of that or all of that? I'll try to narrate a little bit. So CVE, let's talk about the role of CVE briefly. Every single vulnerability scanning product, even attack tools like Metasploit, a trigger into their research and development is that a unique identifier for a known vulnerability gets assigned. And like good little bees, they all swarm around it, they create checks. So most of our checks for vulnerabilities come from a trigger of a CVE. Now there's a number of ways that it is disclosed or discovered in the wild, but we get a CVE and it triggers an entire decision tree. So it's a predicate for all of our vulnerability scanning. It's also a predicate for all of our intrusion detection and prevention signatures and UTMs. So when we do blocking stuff in our HIPs and any sort of blocking technology or detection technology, it triggers a whole bunch of work streams on that. The third use case is for the practitioners. Who's a practitioner in the room? Applied security. Nobody? We're all speakers? All right. So when we get a CVE, we hear of a CVE, we have to do some risk-based assessment based on the base score and our criticality and all sorts of other things, but we take that trigger to decide if and when to patch or shield or take mitigating actions. So when we look at the CVEs, we're going to do a statistical distribution here. The color is the CVSS score on a gradient from green, which is the low score, through red, which is 9s and 10s, right? So there's a number of CVEs in the CVE database. The thing is, we don't actually fix them all. We fix mostly the 9s and 10s, right? So we're already taking a prioritized decision point on a subset of the truth, right? But when we look at that swarm, and as that swarm grows, what very, very few people know, unless you're close to Jericho or the OSVDB or Jake Koons, or you subscribe to something like Secunia or whatnot, is for quite some time now, with the flat budget on a dynamic growth curve of vulnerabilities, vendors, and everything else, you end up with CVE is about 60% of the known vulnerabilities in these paid feeds. And the gap is getting larger and larger. How many people knew that CVE was 60% of the known vulnerabilities? Okay. And again, I'm not bashing anybody. Oh, hey Paul, how you doing? So when you go to make a risk decision, you're prioritizing with a 40% blind spot. How do you know you're actually doing the most important things? So, and then again, if you just want to do the 9s and 10s, we're still talking about 99 vulnerabilities out of this batch, instead of maybe the 120 you thought you were doing, right? So the CVE is down here at 120. There's 600 statistically or proportionally in the Vuln database, or the artist formerly known as OSVDB, because they ended up closing it down. So these are paid feeds, and some of the larger enterprises use one or more paid feeds to get this. But if you talk to like Jake or Karsten or Jericho, the number changes over time, but they'll tell you, actually, we don't keep up with everything. We're about 80% of all the known disclosed vulnerabilities in the world. So when you look at CVE, you're looking at 60% of 80% of the known vulnerabilities. And we can't forget for a second all the as of yet unknown vulnerabilities. So how can we be certain we're doing the 9s and 10s that matter most? And this blind spot was disappointing at first. It was disheartening later, and as the gaps got bigger and bigger, I started to get quite worried about this. How many people knew that besides Paul? Did you know about the 80%?
I did. I was just thinking also, if you look at the CVE coverage across all vulnerability scanning products, I would say that on that, or my friend did that, and
Bob did that?
that's actually about 50% coverage with no CVE.
Right. Yeah, so even the scanners aren't comprehensive within that small set, so I could actually make a smaller subset. So just to punctuate this, guys, if there's 1,000 known vulnerabilities, VulnDB is going to have 600 of them, and CVE is going to have 120 of them, and your Vuln scanner is going to have 60 of them, is what you're asserting? So I haven't looked into that, but I'll take your word for it for now. And then we're only going to do the 9s and 10s. So I'm not trying to break your heart here, but this is a too big to fail thing. It's such a critical piece of infrastructure. In cybersecurity terms, this would be like our bridges and tunnels collapsing and crumbling. This is cyber critical infrastructure. And we are not taking care of it enough. And the likelihood that taxpayers are going to grow this at the rate of other growth factors in a US institution isn't going to happen. Now, who thinks this is pretty bad? Because it's about to get a lot worse. Okay, so let's go back to this notion that there's a 60% of an 80% blind spot. It's not evenly distributed. Bob made me this little bump out for coverage. If you actually look at this, the CVE coverage, almost structurally by charter, focuses and prioritizes on essentially market share for enterprise-grade technology. Cisco routers, Oracle databases, IBM WebSphere. That's partly a virtue of the CNAs. And by the way, there's a special place in hell for an acronym that has an acronym in it. So CVE, naming authority.
It's my fault.
It's your fault? Okay. I warned the MITRE guys in advance that I was going to give some tough love. It's not a critique of them per se. We have to know the problem if we're going to rise to meet the problem. But if you look at this, because of the CNAs, because of what's most important to initially an enterprise mission in the North Star, most of these bugs are in enterprise-grade software. The blind spots that we've been tracking for quite some time, where there's relatively no bugs reported for a bunch of reasons, not limited to CNAs, the industrial control systems get significantly fewer coverage points. The medical devices get even less. Open source libraries and binaries that don't have really a company, like little things like OpenSSL, little things like, I don't know, the Bash project or Shell Shock, little things like Apache Commons collections or Apache Struts 2. Nothing important. No hackers are looking at open source. It's not like there's open season on open source in the last couple of years, right? And then the real doozy is anything in foreign language, right? So there are coverage, there is some, and if you can see the little numbers here, we try to do a best guess, and we're going to work with the MITRE guys and the OSVDB guys and on fixing the primitives behind this data-driven model. You know, Bob's all about the data-driven. But what you see is like you might get 6 foreign language ones, 30 med devices, and 30 med devices, by the way, is being kind out of this 1,000, right? And if we're only doing the 9s and 10s, you know, you're getting significantly less. So it's not simply that we have 60% of 80% of the known vulnerabilities. It's also that they're really skewed towards low consequence failures. The things that where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. The things where you can cause a kinetic impact, where you can have property damage in a power plant, in a hydroelectric facility, in a Stuxnet type environment with Siemens centrifuge devices and controllers. Those are the ones we are most blind on. So the ones most likely to trigger a national security event or a crisis of confidence in healthcare are the ones we are worst covered on. And it's not like we're going to double or triple MITRE's budget or NIST NVD or the subcontractors. They're getting a flat budget for something that's growing like crazy. And there's a whole bunch of other issues, and if I let myself, and maybe if you choose your own adventure, I'll circle back to this towards the end, this is just the beginning of the problem. Some of the public policy work that we've done to try to enhance things with Food and Drug Administration, with coordinated vulnerability disclosure, softening laws for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You're about to see a massive surge in vulnerability disclosures as we've adopted more permission and made it less illegal to do vulnerability research. If you think of the growth rate and the growth curve of IoT devices, all of which are tiny little companies with no P-cert and no security architect and no coordinated disclosure program, the volume and variety of bugs disclosed are going to be going through the 8 people that work at DHS ICS CERT, or the 3 people that triage these for the Food and Drug Administration, or Art Manion's poor team at CERT CC. And when they're uncontested and easy ones, we're already having bottlenecks for the volume and the growth. What happens when they're multi-vendor coordination like a stage fright or like a heart bleed? that require a ton more work. What happens when they're contested issues with huge legal battles like the St. Jude Medical MedSec Muddy Water stock short? The system is not prepared for the current focus on enterprise security. We have no chance of scaling this to the growth of software and connectivity in everything, including public safety, human life. So I'd love to give you a rosy solution and say, oh, and all you gotta do is go buy my product. This is a wicked problem, and Congress has recently taken notice. The House Energy and Commerce Committee doesn't know what I just showed you. They haven't seen the prototype, but they have heard enough of the pocket complaints that they sent a letter to MITRE and to DHS asking for their perspective on the issue. What are the historical problems? What's the spending history been? Which problems are they starting to solve? Which problems are they ignoring? And there are other problems like federating CNAs and stuff. And if you've heard of Kurt from Red Hat, he's working on the DWF thing, which became the federated CNA thing. And there's some plans to federate better on lots of places. There's plans to work with foreign partners better. There's plans to improve customer service. I just learned last week or 2 weeks ago, they've finally added a Twitter feed, 2 Twitter feeds for CVE. One of them is too noisy, so I have to talk to them again. But this is a pretty foundational topic, and if we're gonna apply our finite resources to tackle the most important problems, we better darn well have full visibility into what those are. And just to remind you of something you already know, once a vulnerability is known, it's available to the full range of accidents and adversaries, including script kiddies that use, free attack tools or Kali Linux or things like, Metasploit. So with low talent or no talent, folks can do quite a bit of damage once it's known. There's a very strong correlation between a vulnerability being known and attack density in the wild. In fact, there was even a stronger one. If you look at H.D. Moore's Law, which is kind of born out of spending too much time in the desert at DEF CON and going straight to Metricon the next day. H.D. Moore's Law says the strength of a casual attacker grows at the rate of the Metasploit project, because we had a strong sense that attack density didn't really track to CVE or CVSS score, it tracked to what modules were in Metasploit or free attack tools. And when Michael Reutman, a data scientist at the time at Risk.io, now Kenna, he looked and he said, if you fix something, a vulnerability that's in Metasploit versus just a random CVE, you had a 30% more likely chance it would be used in the wild if it was in a free attack tool. So when you look at these things, of course we're going to make prioritized decisions, but once it's known, if to the bad guys, it's going to get used more likely than not. And if it's known to them but not to us, because we've got a blind spot of a blind spot, and then we prioritize within that blind spot. And if you look at this distribution, we have to fix it. It's a little hard to see, but you can see the ghosted gray behind the medical device bars and the ICS bars. Humans write all the same software. In fact, in medical, it's usually Windows XP or older. And Paul and I talked about that. What was it, Windows 98 you saw? Windows 98 on the system when you went to the hospital. So the probability that this distribution of severity and the volume of bugs reported should be, let's take it as an assumption, they should be fairly similar. And that means that's a really swag, wild guess that we're barely scratching the surface on medical. There's some things that are about to change that, but we're not prepared for that volume. So you guys chose your own adventure. Can I move on to the next topic? Okay. All right, how's my time? Ooh, okay. All right, I'm also going to do something that's not a slide. You ready? Oh, this one's going to get me worked up. Okay, so before I show the next slide, who remembers the CISA Act that turned into a law, CISA? What's it stand for? Computer Information Sharing Act, okay? One of the provisions of the Computer Information Sharing Act, December 2015, was Congress asked for a 1-year task force on cybersecurity in healthcare. I got named, because of the work we do with I Am the Cavalry, I got named as one of the 20 task force members, and it's a 1-year task force. Our due date is May 17th, so it's pretty much done. We started and kicked this off on April 17th. Last year. I got on this is one of the reasons of the SOURCE Boston Marathon discussion earlier. I got on the plane to go fly down to DC for the very first kickoff meeting, and everyone on the plane had a Boston Marathon jacket on. And at the time, I was deeply concerned about mass casualties in clinical the Boston Marathon bombing had a very low casualty rate. Why did it have a very low casualty rate? So when I got to the meeting, and to really ground us that this was not just a talk about PHI or healthcare data or HIPAA, this was a talk about national security. I said, hey, who remembers the Boston Marathon bombing? And everybody in the room, of course, raised their hand. I said, why was the death count so low? And because they're all mostly working at hospitals or in the health delivery space, no one had a hard time answering that. They said, oh, it was easy. It was blocks away from some of the best medical facilities in the planet. And I said, okay, so who remembers Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital shut down patient care for a week about a month ago in February due to a single vulnerability in a single device that crippled the whole hospital with a ransomware from Samsung? So the whole room said, what's your point? And I said, so what if you combined a physical attack with that logical attack? And then the counterterrorism guys in the room, they're like, oh, you know, they turned pale. And I said, look, there's no technical barrier to a deliberate and sustained denial of patient care on any or all hospitals in the US. Like, this is our problem, guys. And I'll get to trick in a minute. But we really grounded ourselves in, this is not a matter of PHI. This isn't even a matter of ransomware. We have material weaknesses in our healthcare, and healthcare is a fifth of our economy. So even if you don't think anyone would ever get killed by accidents and adversaries, any crisis of confidence in the public to trust modern connected medicine could have a massive impact on 20% of the economy or more. So one of the things I can show you, the report was hoping the report was going to be out today, so one of the things I can show you, I have permission to, we can't really tell you our recommendations, but I got an infographic made by Doug Wilson's partner, Neway. So let me see if I can fit it all on the screen. Okay. So the headline is Healthcare Cybersecurity is in Critical Condition. And we had 14 uncomfortable truths that we were going to include. We decided to settle on the top 5. Who in here works in healthcare? You do. Okay. Who in here ever needs healthcare? Okay. That's the are you awake question. All right. And this isn't a Josh-ism. It's going to sound like Josh stuff, but there's 20 healthcare professionals, most of whom have been doing it for 30 to 40 years. And this is the consensus of the group. So problem number 1 is there is a dearth of security talent in healthcare. We have no census on how many qualified security professionals actually work in the field, but we do know the distribution curve of large, medium, small, and rural hospitals. And our estimate is somewhere between 75 and 85% of healthcare delivery organizations, also known as HDOs, lack a single qualified security person on staff. Not a CISO, not a firewall admin, nothing, 0. Let me say that again. We believe somewhere between 75 and 85% of health delivery organizations lack a single security person on staff. And that defied logic for a bunch of reasons, and because you're going to choose your own events or time permitting, we can drill into how far down the rabbit hole each of these 5 points go. But there's no one there to apply the patches, receive the threat intelligence, participate in the ISAC, respond to an emergency. It's basically nurses, physicians, biomed services techs. So if there's no one there, that's a pretty dangerous thing. Number 2, legacy equipment. XP is usually a best case scenario in the clinical environment. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. And I must have spent 9 months going down those recursive circles of hell to figure out why is it this bad and how can we fix it. And I almost wanted to do a whole talk on just that. But XP is often a best case scenario. Is Windows XP supported anymore? Was Windows Vista just announced as end of life for support? So when you have these systems that are way past end of life, lack modern countermeasures, and XP is a best case scenario, at least because it has DEP and ASLR type things, we're in a bad way. So you have no one at minding the shop in most of these organizations, and even if you had a great team from Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase, they're defending really old, antiquated, difficult to manage systems. Number 3, premature overconnectivity. This is actually the government's fault. There's a clause called meaningful use that was attached to the HITECH Act. It had 3 phases to it. What they wanted to do with the best of intention is get us the hell off of paper records. Because So they attach reimbursement conditions to the ability to receive and transmit electronic health records. Very good intention. Get us to modernize our IT. The problem is, the fastest path to money was not to make new devices, not to do threat modeling and adversary resilience testing and secure development and design and secure implementation. The fastest path to revenue and reimbursement for these cash-strapped hospitals and these cash-strapped medical device facilities was to take devices never designed to be connected to anything and force them to be connected to everything. So if you've ever done an assessment or consulting gig in a hospital environment, they are incredibly flat, wide open, over-connected networks, because if you shut down connectivity or try to introduce normal segmentation isolation, systems don't work anymore. One of the reasons Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital shut down patient care for a week was because the issue wasn't so much that none of the systems could work, it's that the connectivity demand they expected in these brittle, poorly interoperable systems was compromised so severely. And if you follow the UK government shut down several hospitals for a week in November and again in January. So again, no one's there to do the security work in most cases. We want to see a real census. Number two, they're trying to defend really old stuff. Number three, it's over-connected, no segmentation isolation, often directly reachable from the internet, even with tools like Shodan. Number four, a single vulnerability can affect patient care, as I've said over and over with Hollywood Presbyterian and others. That was one Java deserialization flaw in one library of JBoss in one medical device. Now, yes, SamSam had a different vector through phishing, but a single Java flaw, a known CVE in one library in one device could shut down a whole hospital. Could you imagine if you or a loved one were driving up in the ambulance bay, bleeding, and you're told, oh, no, you gotta go up the street. It's only a few blocks, but you just gotta go up the street, because seconds don't matter in those circumstances. Can you imagine you've been on a wait list to get a surgery at that facility, but your surgery gets canceled because they can't actually pull the records for your blood type, and you kinda have to know somebody's blood type. If the doctors don't trust the systems, the doctors lose confidence in these connected systems, and their natural inclination is to retreat to more secure, more trustworthy, but older and less effective technologies. So vulnerabilities can affect patient care, and then lastly, the wording on this one's a little weird, but Billy Rios took a look at a random medical device, medical technology. It wasn't technically an FDA medical device, and it had over 1,400 known vulnerabilities in it. And if you think that was an anomaly, we looked at several others. It's not uncommon for an average medical device, between the software, firmware, hardware, and all sorts of junk they put on it, to have over 1,000 CVEs. So pop quiz, back to our first uncomfortable topic. If there's 1,000 CVEs in a medical device, are there 1,000 known vulnerabilities in it? Someone want to venture back of napkin math as to how much worse it is than that? So let me summarize why this is pretty bad. There's statistically we're guessing and estimating about 85% of these health delivery organizations lack a single qualified security person. They're trying to defend things that the best Bank of America team would probably have a hard time defending. They can't do segmentation isolation or keep their stuff off Shodan. SOS, keep your stuff off Shodan. And that was in part due to meaningful use, incentivizing bad behavior. And then one mistake in one device could shut down a hospital, and the bad news is almost every single device has over 1,000 opportunities to do so. So that's the good news. I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom here, but how much of our time and discussion in the digerati, in the research community, in the tip of spear practitioner community is focused on this, versus how much of our community is focused on highly replaceable credit cards versus personal information. In fact, even in the clinical environment, the only governing regulations on this are around patient healthcare information. So we talk about privacy, we love our privacy. One of the jokes we make in the cavalry is we love our privacy, we'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And the overwhelming force and attention is focused on the healthcare information. And one of the reasons we were shocked by that census data is that there's plenty of mandatory information security officers. Somebody in here that has been sending, what about HIPAA? Aren't there security people on staff because of HIPAA? Well, we got to interview one of the top ISOs, or information security officers, in the HIPAA community, who speaks at conferences amongst her peers. And we were shocked to find out that she asked for a CISSP in 3 days. And we said, what do you mean? What's your objective? And she said, well, we've never had security training. And I said, well, but you're the security officer. She said, no, I'm a nurse practitioner. She's like, they picked me because I learned QuickBooks to do our accounting. So when HIPAA came out, I was the designated ISO, so I learned as much as I could from SANS and from blog posts, but I need like a 3-day boot camp. So we actually have a false sense of security because we have all these designated information security officers, and she's doing the best she can with the resources she has. And she said, no one's going to want to come to my rural America hospital to live here. No talent from a big bank is going to want to take a third of the pay and live in, East Nowhere. So this is a wicked problem. I'm full of rainbows and unicorns today, right? I think many of these things are solvable problems. The problem is we're not focusing our energy, our talent, and our innovation on those things. And when this report comes out, we're not sure what kind of political appetite there will be, or legislative appetite, or regulatory appetite there will be to try to fix some of these. But we have done significant work behind each and every one of those as you go further down the rabbit hole. Okay, so I'm going to let you choose your own adventure one last time in this last 15-minute chunk. The next choice is I can show you some of the things that are being done legislatively to rise to some of these challenges. And some of them you're not going to like, but you might need to hold your nose and eat your lima beans, and we might just have to prepare ourselves that doing nothing is no longer an option. And even though you can criticize some of the things that are being presented to us, there are a number of opportunities we can either ignore, take advantage of, bend, break, stop. But I can show you a preview of that. Or I can drill into something like how to maybe solve the wicked legacy technology problems or the workforce problems. Somebody speak up quickly. Okay, all right. I am prepared for this. Okay, so I'm not going to use every one of these slides, but we're going to, some of these need pictures. Okay, so he announced me as one of the founders of IamTheCavalry.org. That's true. We're almost 4 years old come DEF CON. Last year, my deputy Bo Woods and I, on April 1st, we chose to do something really stupid, but really important. We were having pretty profound success affecting FDA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, some things like that. But we were very worried that we weren't going fast enough. So we joined a policy think tank in DC, an international policy think tank called the Atlantic Council. Think tank land is very weird. It's not natural. We speak different languages. When I said CVE, I was talking about vulnerabilities. For 6 months, I said CVE every single day in front of them, only to find out that CVE, does anybody know the other meaning of CVE in policy world? Countering violent extremism. Which is a little hard to take when you see my slide on trick, because sometimes both of them apply. So one of the things we did is we said, all right, let's put our careers on pause and we'll go try to affect some public policy. We wanted to affect 3 things: the Food and Drug Administration post-market guidance for medical devices. Number 2, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration was maybe going to regulate on cars, but they needed a little encouragement and nudge. And number 3, we knew the US Commerce Department was going to try to push for voluntary coordinated disclosure programs. And we thought that would be a great way to make sure that white hat research did not get further criminalized. In fact, maybe it was decriminalized in the places it was already dangerous. We ended up targeting those 3, but we ended up touching at least 8 first-of-a-kind policies that came out of nowhere. So one of the things we've believed is that this is the Cuyahoga River on fire. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire 22 times across 70 years. And this picture, I think, was late 60s. But ultimately, the Clean Water Act wasn't instituted until after this photo, and public outcry said, you know, we probably shouldn't have rivers on fire. Pollution's a bad thing. Now, they had already had millions and millions of dollars for property damage. Bridges burned down plural times. Factories got damaged. But there wasn't really an appetite until you literally had a burning river on fire more than once before someone said enough is enough. So we keep saying we need some sort of triggering event, but the truth is we're probably going to need several. So here's a couple fires that happened last year, right? Everybody knows that power grids were hackable. But we finally can stop arguing over, is it possible, because we've had one happen in Ukraine. We also had people talking about what you could use Shodan or things like that to directly manipulate industrial control systems over the internet, and the DOJ unsealed some indictments of Iranian hackers who successfully manipulated a water facility in upstate New York. Now, there was no water in it, and when they opened up the dam, it would have flooded at most a golf course. But this is an existence proof that they are trying and succeeding at manipulating industrial control systems. The third one I've talked about a lot, which is pretty much the reason Bo and I decided to leave the private sector for a bit, was when I saw Hollywood Presbyterian shut down because of a known vulnerability in a single Java library that was entirely avoidable if people even knew. In fact, they were warned, the whole healthcare industry was warned that SamSam was hitting people, and warned to look for this. And the problem was they had no asset inventory or no idea what the software bill of materials was in any of their stuff. So even though they got the warning, they had no idea if they could answer, am I affected and where am I affected? So ultimately they didn't pay the ransom in time, they didn't take the systems offline in time, and that was the damage. And when I saw this one, who was here for the Source Boston where Jericho and I talked about Anonymous? You guys remember this graphic, right? We had some custom artwork done. The reason we were attracted to these guys was not because they were technically sophisticated. It's because I felt this was a significant development and that they had designed a blueprint that would be adopted and perfected by others in the future. Now at the time there was no such thing as ISIS, but we actually had that blueprint designed in that talk, right? This was from Mar, from 303. The idea of the blueprint was that it would be adapted and co-opted by others, possibly with a more aggressive ideology. Not for the lulz and not for anti-surveillance, but to hurt people. And that was a concern I had, and if you look at the news, the cyber caliphate and the online use of social media, it's undeniable to say that they didn't perfect the blueprint pioneered by Anonymous. Now I meant that more as a general concern, but it became a very, very real concern because a member of Team Poison, Junaid Hussain, he went by the handle of Trick, he lived in Birmingham, UK, he went to jail for hacking as part of Team Poison when he hacked Tony Blair's website. So he spent time in prison in the UK, a very bright guy, not a very good hacker, but good enough, clearly good enough to go to jail for it. Well, he left the comfort of his Birmingham, UK home. They believe he radicalized in prison, but he moved to Raqqa, Syria and started the cyber caliphate. He was the #3 most dangerous man in ISIS. And shortly after DEF CON, year before last, he was met with a drone strike. And when I saw the death of Trick, I said, oh my God. That was someone who had the means, motive, and opportunity to take human life. And then months later, when you see a Hollywood Presbyterian, I said, man, if he was alive, he could totally do that. So one of the justifications for him being killed was he was orchestrating physical attacks, like the Garland, Texas shootings after the cartoon contest. So he was using social media for recruiting, but he knew plenty well how to use hacking script kiddie tools. Who thinks it's not hard to hack a Windows XP system? It's incredibly familiar, especially one you can directly reach from the internet. So I was like thanking the gods that there was no Trick alive to notice Hollywood Presbyterian. But there have since been 2 more cyber caliphate recruits of his that had to get killed by drone strikes, and it's incredibly easy to repeat and replenish him. So I'm not trying to scare you, but sometimes the truth is scary, folks. He's not very talented, but he's talented enough to do serious harm on one or all hospitals. And my fear isn't that a hospital will be attacked. My fear is that it'll be like Deepwater Horizon. Because when we look at the response capabilities with no talent, with old gear, with no segmentation, and no idea how to do so, the response time will be measured in years. There might be a quick fix. They can go to paper backups, they can go to manual processes, but you see fewer patients that way. And people die while you're seeing fewer patients, or care is compromised where you're using older technologies. So it's not the fact that I think we're going to have one of these events. We know we're going to have one of these events. The question becomes, how protracted and prolonged is the response time? This notion that we've told ourselves that you can't prevent things, you must detect and repair, right? Prompt detection, agile response. We've completely resigned ourselves to that, right? But when the consequences of failure involve a death or hospitalization, you can't repair. How do you repair that loss? It forces us to shift left of boom. It forces us to look not for indicators of compromise, but indicators of reconnaissance. Not for sharing threat information after an attack, but for looking for known vulnerabilities and exposures before an attack. And that's really hard stuff. And it's going to take the best and brightest in our community. So, in the few minutes I have left, I'm going to skip some of this stuff. So with the Hollywood Presbyterian stuff, or whether it's Mirai, honestly, Mirai actually probably pushed more public policy appetite than even Hollywood Presbyterian did. Because the prevailing belief is, let's not regulate software, let's not have software liability, let's not have minimum standards for hygiene, because we might stifle innovation or hurt the economy. And that's true, you might. But Mirai showed people that the long tail of low-cost, low-hygiene devices can hurt the economy. Mirai was the largest botnet in history, throwing over a terabit per second, larger than my former colleagues at Akamai can handle at scale consistently, and it was about 20% of its attack capacity on that day, so there's a lot more room to grow. And it was made up of largely cheap internet-connected web cameras that go on the sides of buildings, some home routers. The problem with it is threefold. Number one, it had fixed credentials. That's how it was so easily recruited. Number two, it was internet facing, so it wasn't natted or behind something. And number three, it was unpatchable. So the combination of fixed credentials that can be compromised directly on the internet and are unpatchable creates a huge botnet that is too big for us to handle, and this is just the beginning. Think of the rise of IoT. So now there's discussion around, should we prohibit unpatchable fixed credentials on the internet? Maybe it's the lawn darts of the internet to have unpatchable IoT. So I'm going to skip some of this, even though it's really important stuff. All right, so one of the things policy-wise that the Cavalry has done, that Jen Ellis has done through Rapid7, that Andrea Matwishin has done, is we really wanted to legitimize white hat research, so we worked intensely with federal government. Katie Mazuris has been doing this, Art Mannion's been doing this. This is an infographic, you can ogle at later, but we successfully got 18 different US government endorsements and enthusiastic support for the term coordinated vulnerability disclosure and the practices behind them. These include folks like the Food and Drug Administration, like the National Highway Transportation Administration. The Department of Defense now has a permanent vulnerability disclosure program after their 20-day Hack the Pentagon bug bounty. GSA, NTIA from US Commerce. And the big victory is many of those folks successfully got a DMCA exemption, so it is no longer illegal under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to research, acting in good faith, cars, medical devices, or consumer electronics for the next 2 years from October 28th for a 2-year period. We're working on making that a permanent exemption. But by destigmatizing this, you'll see more permission to research and disclose these things, which will show more types of flaws, which will necessitate different design decisions and patchability, which will inform secure development life cycles. So we thought that this was a gateway drug, and there's, those are the 18 we were directly involved in. There's some in Europe, and then there's some other ones that are happening that we are learning of now. We also try to push primitives like the 5-star cyber safety framework from the Cavalry, which is not to give an ISO list of millions of security controls, but to say if all systems fail, you better be able to avoid failure, take help avoiding failure, capture, study, and learn from failure, have a prompt and agile response to failure, and contain and isolate failure. If you don't have these primitives, because we're terraforming here, these primitives have to be the table stakes for safe, secure IoT. And we really focused on the third-party collaboration, the idea that we're here to help. It's a welcome mat versus a beware of dog sign. So with the Mirai stuff, a couple things have come up that are uncomfortable. This one's a little older, but it's getting resuscitated potentially in the Senate side. The idea of a software bill of materials, an ingredients list of, am I affected by the Apache Commons collections flaw? Am I affected by Heartbleed? Am I affected by this? So the idea of having an ingredients list and a nutrition label. The idea was, tell us the ingredients. They shouldn't be known vulnerable with a CVE. Can you see why I started where I started? If CVE is a blind spot of a blind spot of a blind spot, legislatively, they're going to trigger on something like CVE. So the idea is, you give us a list of ingredients. They shouldn't have known vulnerabilities without mitigations, or you should at least disclose the risks you're passing on to your customer, and they should be patchable. So that is being incorporated in the Underwriters Laboratory's cyber assurance program. The next one that's going on is the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity that published December 1st asked for some very bold things, including they asked the Department of Justice to review the state of the law with regards to liability for software and IoT, which is a huge warning shot to industry. There is no software liability right now. And there's a serious appetite because of Mirai and other things to maybe consider introducing one. So I'm trying to work together with an economist, a lawyer, an insurer, and cybersecurity folks to make sure we understand different flavors of liability and how to contain that so we don't harm the economy, but we do get minimum hygiene standards. You can see some of these later if you ask me, but every single one of these is a first-of-a-kind U.S. policy on some form of cyber safety, including the Department of Homeland Security did one on strategic principles for enhancing safety-critical industries. The FDA put out their post-market guidance, which essentially says you must have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, and any bugs reported to you should be acknowledged within 30 days and patched within 60 days, or you will be recalled. So they went from a standard of care that required proof of harm to realizing that an unmitigated pathway to harm is sufficient to trigger corrective action. So now you should see thousands of device manufacturers welcoming bugs reported by researchers, and they have 30 days to 60 days before they get a recall if they don't do it right. That's big. The DHS ones were more about safety critical systems and public safety. Department of Transportation has put out some guidances not as strong as the FDA, but we're going to keep working on them. Department of Commerce has really pushed 2 projects. Best practices for coordinated vulnerability disclosure, where we put out a template for early stage, not a bug bounty, that's stage 2, but I will not sue you if you act in good faith and follow these guidelines. The Presidential Commission had 2 doozies. I mentioned one. The Department of Justice should lead an interagency study to review the current state of law or liability for harm caused by faulty IoT. And the other one is they want to see a study done for some form of nutrition label to enable free market choice for actionable things to know good products from bad products. Now ultimately it's going to take a few more fires, guys. But these are the kind of things that are entertaining, and even if we hate those ideas, and I actually hate some of those ideas, we have to think of the trade-offs between doing nothing, doing something as a knee-jerk reaction that will make things worse, or how to shape and sculpt these things. Now I don't have all the answers for any of the things we talked about. Not for CVE ecosystem, not for the dangerous level exposure for our modern clinical health environments that affect 20% of our economy, and not for some of these legislative ideas that could make things a lot worse, but I know it'll be much smarter if this group engages. And I respect you all enough to give you the tough problems, and I hope throughout the next 2 days you keep that lens of not what affects our day job or the data we're losing, but what are the really high consequence failures, and what's our role going to be in rising to meet those challenges. If you're inspired even a little bit to get involved, we've created several ways to do so. And at that point, I will end my remarks. Thank you for your time, and I really respect this room, and I really get energized every year. Please make the most of this conference. Thank you.